It's probably the easiest way of doing it.
Okay, so recorded but not live.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Do you need someone to take notes, or are you good?
No, I usually take the notes as I'm going. That's fine. In terms of agenda, so I was thinking the option back for file stream is probably easier, and then we use the other two, like, well, the remaining whatever time we have left for the JSON one. So we would start with the fast parcellization logic, and then we would look at the JSON content type. And what was the default issue that showed up now? Streamability. Yeah, here we go. That's another one we can look at. So awesomeness. So does anybody have any questions, or should we just get started?
I'll be dropping about a half hour before review is over. But otherwise, I'll be here for the first hour and a half.
Perfect. Then let's start with the, what did I say, the file stream one, fast path, this guy, and then that guy. Alrighty, so lay it on us.
Are you recording now?
Yep, we are.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So this is an API proposal that we already reviewed, but the request is to put the recently approved API in a new options bag. I'm talking about allocation size. There was pushback after the API got approved, and it makes sense to put all these properties in a new options bag in case we keep adding attributes, which will eventually happen to FileStream. So the first thing is allocation size was the API that got approved last time. I believe the name was allocation size as it is described by Adam there. And the request is to rename it to pre-allocation size, which makes a little bit more sense. So that's the first thing. The second thing is most of the other properties are the same ones we already have as parameters in the file stream constructors: path, mode, access, share, and file options, which will have a default value just like we set it in the file stream constructors. There's an additional request to add a buffer, a memory of byte. This is for the user to be able to have control of the buffer that the file stream will use internally. There was a user that requested this to be a memory of bytes so that they can have full control and they can be able to even allocate native memory, unmanaged memory. Of course, it has its own dangers, but we can document it really well and make sure that users know about the potential issues of doing that. That's one option, was to using memory of byte, and the other one was there's an alternative design below.
Pool buffer, meaning it's taken from like array pool or something?
I think Carlos's stream fell off.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Can I ask a general question? Why is this a struct?
I was going to ask that too. The follow-up to that is like, should path be a required parameter, basically, because it looks like you always have to specify a path if nothing else.
I think that's why it's non-nullable.
Yeah, but there's like, is there any type of, I don't know, enforcement or whatever saying like, hey, I guess if someone doesn't specify a path and they try calling the constructor, like they're just going to get an exception. But it would be
Right.
nice if there were some type of, some type of compile time enforcement saying, hey, you're misusing this. Because as soon as you
think they
control it 5, you're
actually-
going to fail.
No, I think actually you get it. I think the compiler will actually give you, well, I mean, this is the thing, right? So if you just new up the struct, the compiler assumes everything is assigned by the constructor. And so you probably won't get a warning when you don't initialize path. Maybe
Right.
it gives you one fun. Yeah, no, I don't think it will because it's you said it's non-nullable, so it will be the job of the constructor to ensure it's non-nullable, which it can't. So it will always be null.
There's separate discussion about the concept of required init parameters, and then
Right.
also default struct constructors, parameterless struct constructors.
Yeah.
So is there
And-
precedence for like structs for these kind of options? Like I wouldn't feel like this would be only used on the stack or whatever. Like it's a file stream. It's a constructor argument. Like I'm thinking of like SSL options and stuff. I don't think those are structs, are they? Like for server and client.
No, I mean we usually don't do structs, right? The reason we don't do them is because in order for them to be useful, they can't have a constructor that takes all the stuff, right? Otherwise, you might as well just have a constructor in the first place, right? So the whole point of having these option types is so that you can initialize the properties in any order, and then only the ones you care about, which now by definition means the struct will be mutable, right? And that's usually where things go bad, and that's why we don't use structs. Now, I think this design here assumes it's kind of mutable once because it's only using init. I'm not sure that will hold up because that's a typical problem that we have with language features is unless we actually use them a lot, we don't know yet what the pitfalls are. So for example, with init, I don't even know whether F# or VB honor them, right? So it's possible that they just treat them as get set, basically.
F#. So init is a modrec, VB respects it. F# is getting the support to properly respect it. In particular, if this is a struct, then it should be passed via in. This is the type of struct that should always be passed by in. But I would also imagine that the file stream would end up just storing it as a file stream options itself. And so the benefit there is just removing an indirection and an allocation, rather than having a class wrapping another class to access your string, which is itself another class. You just have effectively the equivalent as if the fields were directly exposed on file stream.
So like I don't understand what you just said. So basically you said init is a modrec. That means assuming a language unlike F# would actually honor modrecs, it would mean they wouldn't be able to know what to do, right? They would basically refuse to use the type or the property, right?
Which also happens for span is effectively modrec by the fact that it's obsolete.
That's like the hacky modrec.
I don't think the modrec in and of itself should be the conceptual blocker for things like this. I think it's more a question of, do we feel like the allocation here is fine, or do we feel like like we want to avoid the additional allocation for the options here?
Well, it's kind of worse, right? Because so let's say let's say we make it a class, right? Does the constructor copy out the contents? Because it can't just hold on to the options, right? Because then, you can verify the combinations in the constructor, but then after the constructor run, the user is free to mess with the class again, right? So you would have to.
Not if it's get init.
Fair enough.
Yeah, as long as the properties are read only, then it doesn't really matter if it's a class or struct.
That's true.
It's just a question of, do you want to have a short-lived allocation that we're going to immediately throw away, or do you want to have a long-lived allocation that's going to live as long as the file stream does?
To be perfectly honest, like I'm totally fine with making a bunch of short-lived allocations because that's really the job of the JIT to make sure that those never end up on the heap.
That's not happening today, and it's not an easy problem.
I realize that, but I do have a feeling that we're basically bastardizing the API. And this group has considered stuff like this quite a bit in the past in order to work around runtime issues that maybe we really should start prioritizing. I realize it's a hard problem.
Yeah. I think it's also, however, not necessarily a bastardization of the API. If in most languages that have structs versus value types, this is the type of thing that is conceptually a struct that you pass as in, so you don't have, double or triple indirections. But that's also not how .NET typically does things. So there's like an A, B side of the coin.
And do we really care about a by val copy of this? Like the file stream constructor is going to be doing like magnitudes more work than just a by val copy.
We can see you, Carlos. We can't hear you. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries, happens.
Yeah, so you were discussing whether we want a struct or a class.
It's just unusual, right? So most of the time, these option types are classes, right? Because in the past, they were all just get set, right? You're proposing get init, which is new. So I'm always hesitant when we use new language features in the VCL because we haven't really used them yet. But I think conceptually, I think that would be fine, right? I think we have a tendency to say like, does the allocation really matter, right? Because usually we know that structs have, prop usability issues. But I have to be honest, I don't quite know where the pitfalls are here with using the struct. So assuming get init works the way we want, it seems like it's effectively unobservable for the user whether it's a class or a struct because you just new it up. You pass it to the constructor. You can't observe mutations because you can't mutate in the first place. Seems relatively fine. Now,
you can.
Does it matter?
That is incorrect, Imo. You can mutate this.
Okay. How?
If this is a field in a class, you can always reassign the field entirely. And if the field's being passed by ref to the constructor, mutations can be observed.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. That's fair.
And because of the init, does that mean that every property has to be explicitly set? Is that correct?
Not every property. It's that you end up using the object initialization syntax. So you do new file stream options, and then you do the open curly brace. Then you do path equals blah, comma, mode equals blah, comma, or whatever order, and dropping whichever ones you want, and then close curly brace, close semicolon. And then
so it'll still have default values.
Right. The default values are just empty.
Gotcha. All right, thanks.
Okay, so the main concern is rewriting the whole struct, which is the case where this instance could be overwritten, unlike a class, which is what we usually do. Even though we have an additional allocation, at least
in your particular proposal here, I think Tanner suggested that file stream should take the options type as in.
Right.
Then I think you have this problem, right? If you don't take it as in, then you just copy all the data over, in which case you wouldn't have that particular issue that Levi mentioned, right?
Right. Although that issue that Levi mentioned is not likely to happen in practice, I think.
Oh yeah, it's like in practice, the constructor is just going to make a copy, like Tanner said.
Yeah.
Okay.
What's the value in trying to get so fancy here?
Yeah,
honestly, you're opening a file stream. Do we really care about 12 bytes allocation?
It's not 12. This is more like 64 bytes at least. But I think it's I don't have a preference on whether or not this is a struct or class. I was just trying to explain the differences between them. I think it mostly comes up as a question of, do we want to be consistent, or is this a case where like ASP.NET or some partner is going to be like, I'm having to allocate fairly frequently in a hot loop with a lot of small files, and it's showing up as overhead. Like, imagine you're processing 10,000 1 kilobit files, in which case you might end up having lots of repeated allocations.
I don't see that being
Yeah.
significant relative to file stream. And what's more is if you really wanted to, you could think about pooling it. Not that we ever would, because it's so small in the
Right.
context of file operations.
Yeah. I mean,
There's definitely options.
If you take path off of this and keep the constructor as file stream path, comma, options, right? Because path is required in order to open a file stream.
So is mode, yeah.
Okay.
Not in
well,
all cases. There's one constructor which Adam didn't add here. That is, oh no, yeah, it's at the very bottom. Instead of a path, it takes a handle, an int pointer.
That's fine.
Even
Then
if you remove path, it's 48 bytes.
Sure.
Okay. And then now if you're in a hot loop and you want the exact same access and share and buffer and whatever, yeah, you just new the options up one time. And then you say file stream path, the shared options, etc.
Yeah, that's a common
can't-
pattern for these kinds of objects, though, is to create the options once and then reuse it lots of times.
You can't do that with
Always
buffer.
only or something like that. I
yeah.
think the point is we should consider designing it in such a way that you can do that.
What do you mean you can't do it with buffer, Tanner?
Buffer here is a memory of byte, so you cannot create a single class that has a buffer set and then use it across multiple streams, because then multiple streams are sharing a buffer.
Well, this is assuming that the constructor would have to make a copy of everything anyway.
Well, you can't make a copy of the buffer. It's a reference type.
Maybe that's a good reason that buffer shouldn't be on the options.
Yeah, I think that's I think that might be the trick, right? If you separate the settings from the, per call information like path and buffer, then you could potentially reuse them relatively safely, right?
Yeah, you'd have to pull off path, buffer, and then you'd probably get something that could be shared most of the time.
I'm still not clear why buffer can't be on here if we have pooling, because presumably you wouldn't add this options class back to the pool until the file stream that's associated with it has been disposed of. Wouldn't that be the typical pattern?
For pooling,
Well,
if you're using the same options for
Right,
multiple file streams that are concurrently open, then you couldn't do it in that case.
Yeah,
Correct,
I think,
but that's just the color being buggy.
right.
Yeah, but the point is that perhaps we ought to let them do that, because that seems like a natural thing for them to want to do.
Yeah, and it might end up being a pit of failure to have buffer on the options type, considering that it's not shareable.
yeah.
And so maybe it needs to be string path, file stream options, and then optional memory byte buffer.
I see. So you're trying to draw, it sounds like, a distinction between how the file is opened, the properties of the file itself versus properties of the stream that happens to be accessing the file. Is that understanding correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if you want to
Because-
optimize for sharing, right? Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think this, I think the meta point, I think, is kind of every time somebody comes with a proposal where they say, I found a way to reduce allocations, we use a structure in this clever fashion. It almost always has usability issues that we at the time either don't realize, or that we should have realized, or there's other trade-offs that are usually involved, right? So it's almost never unobservable. And so the question is it worth it, right? And that is something that I personally don't have a good handle on, because I'm not that much into low-level perf. But in general, we have said in the past, if you do I/O, allocating an object is usually not the biggest problem you're having, right? So that's kind of why I would, kind of ask the question back, like, does this really have to be a struct? Do we really get that much out of it? And then when you design it as a class, then the next step is, well, can I actually pool this in some sensible fashion, like we generally do with option types? And then it becomes just an exercise of making sure that the type is, designed in such a way that, you separate per instance state from shareable state, right? So that basically means buffer and path could go as regular arguments, and then the design as class might be good enough. I mean, my other question is like, what's wrong with the constructors we currently have? Is the idea that we want to grow this thing more and more and more? Because I mean, like right now, it looks like you just have the same arguments that we already have.
There's some extra arguments on there, like the buffer and the pre-allocation size.
This was what came up in the last review. Was we're already getting to 5 or 6 arguments, and we're at the point where it becomes inefficient for the ABI to handle that. And with the IO reworking that Adam's working on, we're likely going to be wanting to add more kinds of configurability and power options to these types. So file stream options here is the way to do that and extend that in the future. So this could potentially grow to be a fairly large options type.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think if we, I mean, I can certainly see that. I mean, that's usually what we said. Like when you have like more than 5 arguments, you probably want some sort of options type. The question now becomes though, if you start doing what was suggested, where we basically have the first argument being path, the second one being options, the third one being an optional buffer. How many optional arguments are we going to add to that overload over time, right? So eventually you now end up with like a different set of overload problems.
So I question the premise there. So like this idea that we have to make options always reusable for concurrent file streams if it's a class, like do we? Like relative to constructing a file stream, like constructing these options, I think is still, as a class, relatively minor. You can still pool it. If you don't use the buffer, you can still use it concurrently. It is a usage error. Like if you know what the buffer does, like you know that you shouldn't be using the same buffer for concurrent file streams. Like I don't know if we have to like make the design more messy just to move like the buffer out of the options class, assuming it's a class.
I think the concern is the pit of failure. The typical user who's going to want to use something like this, or just copy pasting something out of Stack Overflow and reusing it, is not going to think or consider reusing buffer across 2 streams.
Do you think this will be a common property? Like, I mean, I get wanting to cater to the new user, but do you think they'll be using this?
I think it's something that someone's going to be like, my code is slow. Let me search Stack Overflow. They find a post where someone gives the partial solution and doesn't explain the caveats, and they copy and paste it. We get people coming into the C# Discord with those kinds of issues all the time. And we always have to explain, yes, what they provided is correct, but the way you're using it is wrong, and here's why.
But my code is slow because it's allocating a new file stream options. Like that's going to be the first thing to show up in a relatively inexperienced person's app.
No, in this case, I was commenting specifically about they're using a custom buffer to avoid to improve throughput in various scenarios. So you don't have to reallocate large long-term buffers rather than short-lived file stream option types.
I still think that's a pretty advanced scenario.
Wouldn't we say that if you really care about if you really, really, really care about performance, wouldn't we actually direct you to the API that we approved yesterday? Or is that not in scope here?
I think this is different because this is because the other API is working with the raw handle, whereas this one allows you to, for example, use a stream reader with a custom buffer. Which is a different type of advanced scenario.
I see. Would you ever? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
In particular, like Carlos called out, you could allocate a large native buffer that memory backs, and then use that.
The alternative
it's a very advanced scenario. Like this was requested by a user that has some pretty big performance concerns, so it's not going to be commonly used. to answer to the recent question. So I'd say buffer can stay inside the struct, especially since it's not supposed to be shared.
So we're talking if it's not a struct, though. And I think if it's not a struct and we really are concerned about this memory of byte on the options type, the alternative design as a class, I guess, solves that, right? Because there's no memory. If you, I don't know what we're looking at right now. If you scroll down, right, it's just the size.
The size and an enum value.
Right. So, I mean, then it's reusable concurrently and so forth if we're like super afraid of misusage of a class.
Yeah, that's right. Although we would remove the option for the user to manage their own buffer and allocating it themselves. So the argument in favor of the first option, the first proposal, is that it's a very advanced scenario, and the user that requested it explicitly gave an example where they wanted to use a memory of bytes. Another thing about the second proposal, the alternative proposal, is if the user does not use the enum value for pool buffer, we would continue using what we currently have in our code right now, which is using gc.allocate uninitialized array of byte to allocate the internal buffer. If the user passes the flag for pool buffer, then we would use an array pool.
Sorry, what's the default? The default is to not pool?
The default option, if we use buffering, it's to use allocate uninitialized array of bytes.
So not use array pool.
Correct.
Why don't we just always use array pool? Why do we ask the user whether they want? Why does the user care whether we use array pool or not?
Array pool is really dangerous.
And has its own issues, which Jan is working with. Jan has an issue discussing like 10 of them with Mayoni. There's issues with like it not actually pooling when you think it should, with it doing many with it having way too many GC collections that happen in practice, etc. Array pool really needs to be like something that's tied in with the GC for it to be what most people want it to be. I'll find the issue and link it in chat.
Yeah, that would be great, because we use array pool a lot in the networking code, and this is news to me.
So as a concrete example, right, say that someone has improper multi-threaded access to a file stream object, because you can read and write to them concurrently, right, in certain cases. Say that one thread is reading from it while another thread calls dispose. What happens to the underlying array? Does it get returned to the pool while someone's continuing to populate it on a background thread? Like, now you have potentially app-wide data corruption, not just instance data corruption. Like, that's the kind of stuff that we try to be careful about.
Yes, but there's two cases here, right? There's a bug in our code, right? We have a use after free issue. We should not have use after free issues. We should fix those. The other case is if we expose this buffer in such a way that the user can easily induce their own use after free issues, then that's a problem.
Oh yeah, that's like that. If the user is doing something silly, that's on them. But to be perfectly honest, like, our code historically within the framework over 20 years has not been resilient against multi-threaded accesses and other nonsense, against doing checks to make sure that people aren't doing that. And as a result, if we start changing global state within these methods, we potentially could cause corruption. Like, it's a problem that has afflicted Kestrel over the years. They've actually gotten a lot better about it recently, but it's not something that we just want to start adding back to the framework.
Then why do we offer an option to use array pool here at all? It sounds like it's the fuck yourself over option.
As long as as long as this code goes through crazy good review, then it should be okay. But it means that we might need to start synchronizing code paths that were previously not synchronized.
Yeah, I buy that. It just seems to me that whether you use array pool or whether you use array pool, it seems like it should be an internal implementation detail. And either we do it right and properly, and we are sure that we're not introducing issues here, or we shouldn't do it at all.
Yeah, that's fine.
I even had a PR for list of T rejected, which switched just over to using allocate uninitialized array, because there's the chance that a user is trying to access it from 2 threads, makes the length -1, and then you end up with potential corruption and access and the ability to access uninitialized memory that could contain secrets that you didn't want leaked. And so that got rejected because of that.
I'm not contesting that there aren't potential use after free issues. I'm just saying that we shouldn't make it an option if it will cause. On the other hand, we're going to go to the trouble of feeling confident that it's not causing use after free issues. It's strictly an implementation detail, and I don't know why we need to surface this to the user.
Well, okay, so along those lines, right? So let's look at the usage example that's on the screen here. So if I pass a backing buffer, like if I actually pass an explicit backing buffer to the file stream, what does it use that buffer for? Could it potentially be using that buffer outside of a call to read or write or copy to? Like, does dispose potentially operate on that buffer?
Who are you asking? I don't know.
The room. Like, I have a question I don't know the answer to.
Yeah, I don't know.
Anytime a user passes in their own buffer or says you are free to like take this array and use it internally rather than allocating your own, there's always the chance that they're doing something illicit with it. We have allowed that in a few scenarios, and there's cases like immutable array builder, where you are allowed to create an immutable array from the builder using the internal array tracked by the builder, but never using some array that you pass in yourself. And so there's like this balancing act there that we have in most of the APIs we expose today.
Yeah, so what I'm drilling in on this usage example is the line that begins using file stream write equals new file stream advanced. So within those 3 lines, you create the file stream, you call copy to, and then you return the buffer back to the array pool, and then at some future part of the method, the file stream instance is disposed. So the file stream instance presumably still owns the underlying buffer while the call to arraypool.share.return is taking place, because the file stream has not yet been disposed of. Is my understanding there correct?
Yes.
That seems broken.
Right. And that's the issue. Anytime a user provided buffer is passed in and we don't copy it, it ends up becoming a very powerful and performance oriented thing, but also a potentially unsafe and can lead to undefined behavior or corruption in places where, for example, users didn't put the closing curly brace around the using before the return.
Yep.
It's the kind of thing where, as a framework and library author, I really want those kind of APIs, but I also want none of the average application developers to ever see them or know they exist or use them themselves.
To be perfectly honest, like the way that certain other C-style APIs solve this problem is you pass an allocator and a deallocator to them rather than the actual buffer. So the file stream will fetch from the allocator, like, hey, I need some buffer. And then when the file stream is done, it will then return it to the deallocator. Right. I don't know if that would work here, but it's because it means like file stream is now potentially calling user code like inside of dispose, which is a bit weird inversion, but.
Right, and you can end up with the same issues there as well.
Yeah.
It's just more explicit on let me free the thing when it's time, rather than you freeing the thing when I'm done.
Yeah.
Or when you think I'm done, rather.
Yeah, I'm having trouble wrapping my mind around the fact that the usage example looks innocuous but seems like it has a bug. Or at least my gut check tells me it has a bug.
I mean, can we separate the buffer out from the design of the options type? And say, like, let's pretend for a second there's no buffer. Are we okay with the proposal here? If not, what would be changed? And then the secondary proposal for, passing the buffer.
It sounds like the changes are take string path explicitly, take file stream options as the second parameter, make file stream options a class because we're not super concerned about the allocation.
And we can leave the buffer discussion for a separate review.
Yeah, because it seems like the buffer one, I'm not sure how much context you have versus Adam, but basically the question is, do we really want people to control the buffer? Or could we do what basically Jeffrey was saying? It's like, well, either we decide that array pool is fine and we handle it ourselves, or we allocate a buffer inside, but it's an implementation to the file stream. You don't get to pass in a buffer.
Yeah, Adam has more context than me. All I know, this is it's an advanced scenario, and it's meant for internal use, what the buffer that we pass. So I agree that if we want to leave it for a separate discussion, that would be okay. And we can now talk about the additional attributes that are mentioned.
I also think that maybe the buffer question is one that we need to sit down with Jan and Mayoni and talk about a bit more holistically. That kind of advanced allocation and deallocation scenario is likely something that isn't just file stream, but potentially more like span, where we'd sprinkle it throughout the BCL in important low-level core types like file stream, or other allocating types. And so we probably want to come up with an actual feature for that.
Okay, I don't mind if we move it to a different discussion.
Well, it certainly allows us to make forward progress on this issue here. Otherwise, we have to flip the whole issue, which might not be useful.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just to be clear, the allocation size is a hint, right? Like if you can't honor it, then you don't honor it, whatever. Is that right?
The allocation slice, you said?
Yeah, like it's not enforced, correct? It's like a hint, and if the system can't honor it, well, okay, sure, whatever. Is my understanding there correct? Because clearly the API will work even if you don't specify it, correct? The pre-allocation size?
Yeah.
Okay. So that means presumably if you specify the wrong pre-allocation size, at worst maybe you'll get a ding on perf, right?
Most likely. I don't remember the discussion. That was the API that got approved the last time.
Okay.
The only request here for that API was renaming it pre-allocation size.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. And the other discussion was adding the attributes to those obsolete constructors, because they are the first ones that show up when constructing a file stream, but we're not supposed to use them. The first constructors that show up when using IntelliSense, and we want them to disappear since they are not recommended anymore. And we were told that this is something that needs to be approved here, adding that attribute.
Do it. I am a huge fan of this idea.
Okay.
One question I have, which I feel is a Jeremy question, is pre-allocation size. Is allocation supposed to be capitalized or lowercase? Because there's a mix of it across various languages and dictionaries.
Let's see.
Which one?
Pre-allocation size. Is that meant to be pre-space allocation or pre-allocation one word? There is a variety of it across languages. And I know if I were to write a local variable, I would do it all lowercase.
So
and then
we have
capitalize.
precedent. We actually have precedent for this, pre-allocated overlapped, and it is capital A.
Is
Darn.
pre a word?
We also have other like pre-allocated attribute target extension in ASP.NET Core, which is lowercase a.
APIs of .NET is not showing that.
I went to source.net.
A word. PRE isn't a word.
I feel like consistency is overrated. Like endpoint, I also feel is improperly capitalized in the DCL, and when we like use that word in ASP.NET, we tend to lowercase the p. Like, pre's not a word.
Pre is not a word. You're right.
Yeah, I feel like hyphenated words should be. There's some of them that I think should be separate, and others that I feel are like one word. Like login used to be 2 words, but nowadays everyone considers it 1 word.
Yeah, I don't really have enough of a preference to say one or another.
Maybe we should tag Jeremy. Maybe we should approve it, and with a Jeremy will tell us whether it should be pre lowercase a or pre capital A. And whatever Jeremy says is right.
If you feel strongly that A is lowercase and the rest of us are like meh, then I think you would probably win anyway.
Maybe, but I feel it's a case where I'd probably defer to Jeremy, since he's generally the like de facto framework design guideline on the capitalization rule.
The fact that we need to have a dedicated person because we can't decide on the rules kind of shows that the rules are not ideal. Like,
yeah. I know how I'd write it myself, but then how I'd write it myself isn't necessarily how the framework does it. So.
No, I mean, and we are inconsistent, right? It's the same stuff with IO and ID, right, where we can't quite decide. But I think either one is fine. I mean, pre-allocation is also not the word that is like used that much where consistency really matters. So.
And we're inconsistent with other things. Like looking at endpoint, like we have different capitalization of different types in the runtime. Like endpoint in system.net has capital P. Endpoint permission also, well, that's in system security permissions, has a lowercase p. Like, I don't know.
I'm scrolling through APIs of .NET, just doing a search for pre. I'm yet to see a single place where we've used the prefix without capitalizing the next word.
Yep.
It's every single time pre is treated as a word.
There's pre-canned precedence, although that's not really pre.
That's
pre-canned?
Preamble.
Oh. Okay.
He has you on preamble.
ASP.NET uses pre-allocated lowercase a. The actual libraries uses pre-capital allocated in one place. Preceding is lowercase.
Let's
pre-calculate.
Let's just say we record it as an issue. Jeremy can decide, and then let's move on, because I don't want to burn 2 more time on discussing capitalization rules.
Yeah, sounds good.
So what I have right now is basically there's no notion of required properties for struct classes. We should extract path and keep it as a constructor parameter. Does this need to be a struct? Structs always have usability issues in this API. It seems like the one where the constructor does so much work that the allocation of the options type doesn't seem to matter. We talked about the p-allocation one. We're happy with the obsolescence one. Anything else that I missed? Buffer.
We're removing
the buffer.
So we're removing buffer, but there is the existing int buffer size parameter. And
the sizes are fine. Yeah.
So we wouldn't include it either because it's in the alternative design related to the buffer.
Okay.
It's part of the separate discussion.
It just seems a little bit odd, I guess, that you'll be able to that the new overload covers all options plus one new additional option except for buffer size. I don't have a particular preference though. Just wanted to call it out.
Do you need a constructor overload that takes a safe file handle and one of these options? I feel the same way. Because I see that there are some public constructors that that take safe file handle as a first parameter, and it looks like they, to some extent, kind of mirror the constructors that take a string as a first parameter. So I'm just wondering if, again, for consistency, we should say like, well, if you have a safe file handle instead of a path, like you can still pass all these options. Granted, things like a file mode and so on don't make sense at that point.
Yeah, I'd say yes, provided that Adam doesn't see any issues with that. Okay. I'd guess that there isn't, given that, given what's exposed today, but maybe there's some edge case scenario with the handles that prevents it with passed-in handles.
The handle is already an open file, right? So which of these options would actually make sense there if you've already opened the file?
Whatever parameters presumably already exist on the safe file handle overloads. Access, buffer size, is async. Actually, no, is async doesn't make sense because that's already a property on the handle. Probably access any native buffer that you pass in, or any memory of T buffer that you pass in, assuming we want to do that, and so on. Might not be worth worrying about. If you have a handle, maybe we just say, look, for better performance, use the other APIs. You have a handle anyway.
And it looks like the safe file handle takes things like file access, buffer size, and is async today, because it looks like it does some validation that what the user wanted the handle to be used as is what the handle actually supports. Okay, if I'm following the logic here right. It looks like it calls into a general constructor and then does validate handle with the parameters, validating that they all line up.
Does this capture everything?
We're saying we're not going to add the constructor that takes a safe file handle and these options, right?
I think that's a sub note of Adam should determine whether or not that's appropriate, and if so, then create the tiny proposal for us to review.
Right. Yeah. Let's not add it here. That sounds good to me.
Yeah, because I think it's dependent on what Adam says is appropriate here.
All right, so then
sorry, real quick, the file stream options, why aren't they get set?
So that's, I wanted to talk about this too. So if you make this a class, is there still benefit in using init? I guess the answer is yes, because then it's, write once rather than multiple times.
Right. If it's a init, then the then the file stream can safely hold on to the options. If it's not init, the file stream will presumably have to create a copy of every individual field passed in, because otherwise they could be mutated out from under it.
Right, which I'm super assuming here, but I assume it already has all these as fields itself because they were constructor parameters before.
Right. So I think it's just a question of, do we want to carry the file stream options directly, or do we want to copy anything passed in here out into separate fields?
Yeah, I mean, the question is, should this be an immutable type or not, right? Yeah. Like, and once we go down the immutable path, like we can't add new mutable things to it.
Right, but the mutability, like file stream itself can't have it be mutable. And so then it's just a question of, do we want file stream to hold on to it or not?
My default answer here would be these should just be get set properties. So I can say new file stream options if blah dot mode equals something, if something else. I can set the properties inside of ifs if I want to. Again, it's kind of the case of, is there value in getting fancy here?
I'm not really sure immutable is fancy, but
well, it is fancy in the way that you just exclude languages, right? I mean, if you only look at it from a C# lens, then it's mostly a style thing. But even there, keep in mind that if you do init, you have to use an object initializer, right? The normal, options dot approach no longer works. And today, for most people, that's mostly a style thing. Like, do you prefer the braces or do you prefer the individual assignments, right? And with this one, you basically push people in something that is, I mean, new might be a stretch, but like new-ish, right? And so
that's also
kind of more fancy.
That's also where C# is moving in general with things like records and stuff like that to immutable data by default, because that's beneficial in a lot of scenarios, and that's how F# is by default. It's you get immutable types unless you explicitly say
yeah,
so.
no, I think nobody disagrees with that. I think it's just that when you look at very fundamental types that have been the platform for 20 years, yeah. It's just a function of like how fancy do you want to be, right? Like if there's value, then I think it makes sense, right? And wasn't included there's value in concurrent access. Here it seems like, well, you're copying it in anyway, so meh. So it seems like we have the notes recorded. At this point, like, should we approve it or should we just push it back with, here's our feedback. If you like it, take it. If you don't, come back.
I'd approve it. I mean, there's no reason to block it, right?
Yeah. And if Adam has any pushback about anything, he can always reject our approval.
So we're keeping the init, not get set?
Sorry, I needed to change that. Let me just edit this guy out here first, and then yeah, I would push towards get set, honestly.
What? Sorry, what was the rationale for get set versus init?
So the argument is if you use get in init, basically you have to use a collection initializer syntax in C#, and you most likely can only use C# to begin with right now because F# is still getting it, and VB probably will never get it. So basically, you just exclude languages. Now the question is there any benefit in init only? And it seems like the constructor will very likely either already copy the data into fields anyway, or immediately forward it to some call that doesn't require them to hold on to them. So do you actually hold on to the option types? And I think the answer is probably no.
That seems reasonable. I think there's one other small benefit, which is that there's some small guarantee that this is not getting mutated currently, but I don't know that matters.
It also looks like VB may have gotten the minimal support required to support init only properties. I'm seeing PRs from Alexei that look to be touching VB and adding that.
I mean, usually the bar they have is VB should handle it, but handling often means just rejecting it. So, I mean, yeah, we should look into this. I mean, this is the problem, right, with language features, right? I mean, unless we know exactly what the downsides are in using them, it's hard to say, yeah, let's add it to an API, right? Because it seems problematic to, as Eric said, you get fancy, but then you accidentally exclude a large chunk of the customer base without realizing it.
At the same time, if we're consistently sticking with syntax from 20 years ago, and that only languages that are no longer updating themselves can support, then we're going to end up with a with a modern language and a very non-modern BCL.
I mean, that's fair. I think it's not quite as, black and white the way you painted, but there certainly is an argument to be made for, the BCL is always more conservative with the uptake of language features, right? And some of the stuff we have, like, yeah, the question is it worth it to do that, right? Like how much, and I think in this case, the question really is, even if we were to say, oh, we really like immutable types, right? But does it actually do anything? Like if it actually buys you something, I think it's fine. But if it doesn't, then I don't know. Easier is easier.
Yeah.
But yeah, all right. Let's keep that for now, and then Adam can tell us what he thinks. I'm pretty sure he will have opinions. And then we probably have to talk about the buffer one separately, anyways.
One last nit there is obviously there's a constructor, a parameterless constructor to file stream options.
Yeah, there's more than that, right? These are there's also the safe handle ones, right? That are omitted.
No. The new class file stream options.
Yeah, it's not a struct, so you need to explicitly define the.
Sorry. Yes, fair enough.
I mean, I know it's implied. So there's no confusion.
No.
Sorry,
totally.
what was the request, Eric?
We need to add a public constructor to the options type, otherwise you can't instantiate it. Basically, this line here. Right, because it's no longer a struct, right? If we don't have a constructor, then it's not a very useful type. All right, so then I think we discussed this to death in 1 hour.
Thank you.
So much for my hope that this is a fast one. All right. Thank you, teams, for stopping to present. Oh, you just switched. Okay, never mind.
We can see you.
Hello? For some reason, Teams is switching windows on me. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So we've checked in the first version of the system text JSON source generator, which takes the approach of moving the metadata gathering about types that we do on first serialization of a type from runtime to compile time, and that gives some benefits like reducing the amount of time it takes to start up apps, reduce private bytes, and improved app size. Another goal we have for source generation in 6.0 is to improve serialization and deserialization throughput. And these APIs that I'm proposing should help us have a mode in the source generator where we can generate serialization code. Deserialization is also being discussed for 6.0 as well, but it's not included in this proposal just because of scope, and like deserialization is a bit less trivial than serialization due to things like property lookup and other like technical scenarios. But so I just wanted to mention that. So here, API proposal. So starting with the JSON type info T, we already have this type. So all that's on the type currently is just it's abstract, so users can instantiate it. So the only member we'll have on it here is an action, which will take UTF-8 JSON writer and an instance of a type to serialize. And the source generator will provide an implementation which honors some predetermined options indicated at runtime. So that leads to the next type here, JSON serializable options attribute, which directly maps with a subset of the types we have. I mean, the options we have on JSON serializer options, which the only ones included here are ones that we can actually support. I mean, where we want to generate code for those scenarios. So features that are feasible to to generate source code for. So first of which is like the default ignore condition. When should we ignore properties on serialization? Like when null, when default. Ignore read only fields saying if a field is read only, don't serialize it on, don't include it for serialization. So again, we have that on JSON serialize options itself. Ignore read only properties, similar but for properties. Ignore runtime custom converters here allows us to not generate codes that, so today we generate code that checks whether custom converters have to be honored. But this can allow us to remove that check and also remove the check and also have less code that is generated and reduce some complexity in the generated code. Includes fields similar. JSON known naming policies is a new enum that we'll see later, but it just basically tells us like what is the naming policy to be used, and the only things that we can express here are things that are like we know the implementation for, like the built-in camel case policies, the only option for that. If we get around to sneak case in 6.0, then it makes sense to include that here. Right indented as well. So moving on to serialization namespace, system text JSON serialization. Please scroll down a little. But so today we only allow.
Before we go back, can I have a quick question? So so you're proposing basically that these options are applied at the assembly level, right? So they are kind of all my types that are serialized in that assembly will use the same serializer options, right? So they're basically globally defined ones, right?
Yeah, that is the assumption that we make in this case. That so that maps to using one instance of existing serializer options. So
for everything in that assembly.
For everything in the assembly. At least that's the current assumption.
How do you
so
know
does this mean if I need different options, I need to split my code into multiple assemblies?
To be able to, for fast path purposes, it would only be this set of options that will generate serialization code for. If you use different options instance at runtime, we'll have a check to see whether we can use the fast path, whether the options are compatible. If they are not, then we'll fall back to just using the serializer. So you still, in that scenario, you would get all the benefits of, like all the other benefits apart from throughput, because the serializer will not be calling this generated code. It will just. How
do you know if they're compatible?
So we'll, at the start of serialization, we'll check the values on the options instance. So if, and then we can compare some of the values quickly.
Compare them to what? The assembly level attribute?
Compared to the assembly level, to the option specified on the assembly level attribute.
So at runtime, you're going to read this assembly level attribute. How do you know which assembly to get it?
No, we'll have, yeah, so today we have with the context class or type, we'll have an internal property that tells us, or an options property that tells us what the expected fast path options will be. So internally, the serializer will read that information from there. So, and we'll generate the value of that options instance at doing source generation. So we'll actually have an options instance to compare against. So we'll not be doing it with reflection at runtime. And optimize, like we can look into computing some sort of hash to see, like to make the comparison faster than iterating through like these members on the options instance. But it will be a one-time check on at the start of serialization. So it shouldn't be a big perfect to confirm that we can actually call fastpath.
So if I wanted to use something like lowercase naming policy, I would have to put it in both places, both on the assembly level attribute and at my runtime code where I knew up the options.
So if you do want to use the one set of options, so we have the JSON context.default. So that default property today just uses the default serializer options, but your default will be the default that you've set on the assembly. So you don't have to, you can just call JSON context.default. So you don't have to new up your own. Yeah. So go ahead.
For certain things like the naming policy, it is possible that we generate code that can dynamically, pull the option or pull the naming policy off of the JSON serializer options and call that. But you're proposing that would actually generate the lower level code for the policies that we know about in this case?
Yeah, the proposal will be that we know just the known, we allow just the known policies. And
we would do this at design time, presumably then.
Yeah, we'll generate. So the generated code will not be inspecting options. It will just use the pre-generated information it knows.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I have to say that I'm not super keen on is that you effectively constrain the source generation to one JSON context per assembly, because that seems also somewhat arbitrary, right? It doesn't, you could still have a fast path and just allow multiple JSON contexts, right? Because it's like the fast path is just a function of you having the static information and being able to spit out the code, right?
Yeah, that's what it is.
I've seen some other serialization texts allow you to specify it at namespace granularity, not necessarily assembly level granularity. To be honest, I don't know how much success they've enjoyed in practice. Since I think most people just put all their models in a single namespace anyway, so whatever.
So the model that I have in mind is that instead of you just spitting out JSON context, you could imagine that the user has to define the JSON context type, give it a name, right? And then put, instead of putting the assembly level attributes, you put all the JSON serializable attributes on that type, and then you basically spit out the body of that type. In which case I can have JSON context 1, JSON context 2, JSON context 3. They can have completely disjoint options. And if I just want 1, I get 1. If I want 4, because I have different contexts, it's pretty straightforward for me to do that, right? But right now in your design, basically, I would have to literally create a separate assembly just so that I can have naming policy A and naming policy B, right? Or one has read-only fields, one doesn't, or something, right? And it wouldn't really change anything. It would just mean instead of having, basically instead of you just magically, creating the entire type, the user only has to define effectively the type header and then apply the attributes on that type. That seems a little bit more, I think, in line with how serialization generally works, because the idea is that you have these options that are specific to a call site, and with the source generation, you allow the user to have as many call sites as they want per assembly, and it's a bit more straightforward than to say, oh, yep, you can only have one options for the entire assembly.
In the model where we have different contexts which we just fill out, it'd be okay to, if we cannot share code effectively between the generated context, would it be okay to have say it duplicates just 2x the amount of code that we generate? I mean, we try as much as possible to share it, but
that's a legitimate concern, right? Because you would have to create a third type somehow, right? That you can reference from both, right? And now the question is, how does the user define that, right? But I guess that's just the way it is. I think, code bloat is certainly a concern that is worthwhile thinking about.
In addition, so in that model, would apply the attribute, the JSON serializer options attribute on the context itself.
Yeah, basically you say on this context, I want to basically, this is basically the home for all the pre-generated serializers, and you apply all the attributes on that type for the things you want to be generated into that type, right? So I think that's generally the kind of the pattern of most source generators, is that the user defines the method or the type, and then somehow annotates that with to be filled out by a generator, right?
Yeah. It's something I can definitely like try out and see how that would work. But it's okay. It's okay to continue to like look at the rest of the stuff and see what makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, what I like about this approach in general is that you give the user way more control, right? You basically let them control like all the normal things they may want to control, like what namespace does this type get generated in, what's the name of the type, is the type public or not, right? All these things are trivially configurable because the user literally typed it out, right? So there really isn't any magic thing on the side that you have to invent of, okay, how does the user control the type name? Oh, there's this other attribute that I can apply on my assembly that controls the name of the type or something, right? And then you just duplicate effectively what C# can already do by just typing out characters, right? I mean, I don't think it would change any of your concerns, because I mean, you still have this problem that you have to somehow describe the option statically, right? Which is what your attribute does. And I think, yeah, there is this unfortunate duplication between, the current serializer options and this new attribute. But I don't know what else to do, because yeah, we clearly don't want to ask the options at runtime and then generate code for every possible configuration option, right?
Well, along those lines, if I'm using not source generators, and I specify this attribute at the assembly level, like what happens when I call JSON serializer dot whatever? It looks like, if I'm reading the description correctly, it is in fact honored.
It is not.
Okay.
Like we wouldn't, unless we wanted to have a design around that. I think a user has talked about that before, but I couldn't think of a scenario where where you want to do it at runtime. So I mean, I guess that it's an open question to say like.
I guess two thoughts on that. Like first, it seems like it would be weird if one API respected it and the other API didn't, just from a consistency standpoint. But I mean, you clearly understand the scenarios better than I do. The other thing that I wanted to call out is naming an attribute class the same as the name of another type in the framework, in this case, JSON serializer options. We might run into conflicts there. You can imagine that if I declare a JSON serializer options attribute instantiation in a file somewhere, I might also be importing the system text JSON namespace all up within that same file. And now like I have two things that are basically called JSON serializer options because the attribute suffix is elided. I'm pretty sure the compiler can figure this out, but I think it is confusing to people. We might want to call it like JSON serializer option defaults or something.
Well, I think, I mean, it is, I think in many cases, actually desired, right? So what comes to mind here is GUID, right? You have a GUID type and you have a GUID attribute. And it kind of makes sense to name them the same because they're kind of describing the exact same thing. I think the problem here is that they are not really describing the same thing, right? Like, I mean, yes, they're both options, but the shape of the JSON serializer options type that we have today is fundamentally different from the attribute, right? Because one of them is a dynamic extensible system where you can put in converters and you have, polymorphism with the naming policy and other stuff, which this one just fundamentally can't have. So it seems to me like, yeah, I mean, I don't think the duplication is necessarily bad. If this would just be an orthogonal thing, I think having the same name is fine because, as Levi said, the compiler can figure it out. But I don't like the idea that, to the earlier question of like, what if I apply this assembly level attribute and I only use the reflection path? Looking at the code, is that obvious to me? Because the name is JSON serializer options. It doesn't really shout like generation or whatever, right? I mean, that was my other question earlier. Like, should we actually consider having a namespace that is more dedicated to generation, where we can say, here's all the stuff that you use for source generation? Because it is unfortunately in many ways like an alternative way to do the serialization. You have to call different APIs, you have to use different things to configure that, and then if you create this overlap, you kind of muddy the waters again for the users. And then I can totally see people having confusion where like, oh, I put this attribute on my assembly, But when I do serialization, it still doesn't honor them, and it's like, well, yeah, because you do reflection-based serialization, that's why it's not honored, right? I think we may want to just really clearly draw this line in the sand and say, yep, there's two ways to serialize. One is we generated a thing. The other one is you do it by runtime, and there are different namespaces or different APIs, and just you have to accept that fact of life.
So in your ideal world, then you want the actual attribute name to clearly indicate like this only affects source generation, right?
Kind of. I mean, or we just say, at least you don't want to. I mean, to your point, right? It's really bad if the type name is the same, because you kind of explicitly say they're related, but they're really not.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm okay with like JSON serializable, even though it doesn't say source generation. Like it's if there were in a namespace that is kind of like, I don't know, system text.json dot serialization dot generator or something, right? And then we put all the stuff in there. I think that would make sense, right? But
well, it is under its own namespace, right, Leomi?
It's under the metadata namespace, and it's something we do want to revisit, because we're like Steve and the crew are currently looking at some other scenarios that these like metadata APIs can enable for some features that we have. So I know it's definitely something that we want to consolidate, like the efforts and the namespaces there. So like after that work is done, then we'll have a clearer picture, like what stuff is like general metadata APIs and what stuff is specifically for source generation. I think it makes sense to move things around. On the serializer options and reading the attributes, it's a bit difficult because like how do we instantiate those options at runtime? Like we don't want it to replace the default options like that we use within system execution, because that affects other assemblies. So would somehow have to generate an options instance that has the same value, and this is outside of the source gen work, and somehow tell the user where that options instance would live and that they should pass it to the serializer. Like it doesn't seem like it's something we should share for both source gen and not source gen. So
you couldn't do that, but I mean, you could say that if you generate, I mean, the JSON context that you spit out could have either a property or a method that basically creates options that match the assembly level attributes, right? And then that's the way you would acquire that if you wanted to, right? But yeah, you should not change the default options, of course.
Yeah. So yeah, I think just in general, like we should distinguish and say like this is for source gen, whether it's by the namespace or like the name of the type. Sure.
My other concern is like if we say you can get a JSON serializer options instance somehow out of this attribute, you're also kind of making a statement that one is a strict subset of the other, right? Which we may not be able to do, right? So I can totally see a world where we have options that affect source gen that we can't honor at runtime because it's too late or something, right? Or the shape is fundamentally different, right? And then it's kind of backwards again.
Great. Shall we move on?
Did we solve whether this is an assembly level thing or not?
I mean, I would certainly write down the note of saying, it would be nice if source generation were not assembly level wide, but like rather type context wide, and the user types in the name of the context class and they can control whether they have one or many. That seems desirable in my opinion.
So that is a different developer experience than we have today, right? Because we generate the context class.
Yes. No, that's orthogonal to this issue, but it's just like the more and more we configure the assembly level one, I think the more and more this becomes a desirable thing to have.
I mean, yeah, it's pretty related to this issue, right? Because before, the stuff that we generated, it didn't matter what options you used. We generate just straight up type information into the stuff. And now with this, we're saying, here's now like policy stuff getting generated that isn't assembly wide, right?
We didn't generate code previously, though. the serializer method?
No, that's the point. That's the point. Is like previously, all the stuff that we source gen was only based off of what's the type, how many properties does it have, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Right now we're putting policy in, like what's the naming policy, what's the number handling policy,
So
whether I should write it indented or not. Like even that being an assembly level thing that you have to burn into the whole assembly seems super odd.
But this is how most, I think, apps will work. They will new open options, and you can't change. The options are immutable once serialization or deserialization has occurred. So they are effectively locked. And I think that, yeah, if you're calling an external service and they have a different naming policy, for example, there are cases where you have to new up a different options today. But I think for your own code, especially, one options instance, is sufficient.
Right. If you have the same type and you need to pass it to two different services that have different naming policies, like that's the option. That's the problem here. You can't use the source gen, this fast pass source gen, without splitting it into two different assemblies.
Is that a first class scenario you want to solve for, where like in this model, like you still be able to pass the options and they'll be honored, you just don't get the fast pass? Like, is fast pass for one set of options per assembly acceptable? I mean, I guess are there scenarios, or do we consider those as like paramount?
I think to help answer that, I mean, the scenario that we're just talking about where you might have multiple external services, if you have types that mix and match between that, I mean, class A has a property that exposes class B, and class B is in another assembly, and now we say you have to have two context classes for that, that does affect the high level programming model if you need different options for the two different contexts. Because today we have a single context class that one universe with the same options essentially.
Well, I think that will be unchanged, right? We would just say you can have more than one universe in a given assembly, but yeah, within that universe, you can only have one set of options still. So you can't really have a case where, within one JSON context, one type uses Pascal casing and one set of types uses camel casing,
yeah.
right?
I mean, if you could apply that.
That's unfortunate, but I also don't know how to do that, because otherwise, have like a gazillion configuration options.
You would have to be able to apply this attribute to a type or to a property.
Right, which we can do that, but that only really works if you own the type, right? So this idea today that you can apply the attribute to type from another assembly, that would get complicated if you can now apply it to members of that type, because now you end up in this world where you have like type level attribute, or sorry, an attribute that takes a type argument and then takes a name argument or something to actually indicate the member, right? And then it gets really like.
I mean, that's exactly how data annotations works.
And we have that attribute already. If you don't own the type, you put an assembly level attribute that references that other type.
Yeah, that makes sense, because imagine a scenario like, let's just throw something out there, Azure SDK, right? They have model types probably spread out across multiple different assemblies, and those types might have different canonical ways of serializing themselves. Like, you don't want an attribute in assembly A to affect how a type from assembly B is serialized, because it might have its own generation code already baked in, right?
Yeah, I guess that's fair. I mean, maybe that's the way we do it then. And this assembly level attribute would now be applied to the JSON context that the user owns, but it's still the same concept, right? You just say, you refer to another type, maybe a member, and say, here are some serialization specific options. And then, that might not be a bad model.
I kind of like that design. That the way I understood you, Emo, saying is like the user would have to write partial class my JSON context and then apply this attribute to it. And then we'd source gen the other side of the partial class, all the serialization methods and whatnot.
Yep.
And then I can have two of them if I want. I can have my JSON context that talks to AWS and my JSON context that talks to Azure or whatever.
Yep.
So in that case, like, will people be passing runtime options, like say for a constructor to, or will it just be using design time options with the attribute? Like, could you still pass an options instance to the context constructor?
We would code-gen that, I think. We would code-gen constructors in the partial class.
So that means anybody that wants to use source-gen will have to specify the options at design time.
No. No, like if they didn't put
So
this
if they didn't,
on
then
it,
we'll just use default. We'll just use the default options.
yeah, I actually like this design even more now that I'm thinking about it, because one of the things that I don't like about using the JSON source gen is that it just I have to magically know that there's this .source gen namespace, and I have to magically know that there's a JSON context type in there, right? Like I have to make a mental leap. Like I put these assembly level attributes on, and now I just magically know that there's some other type there. Where if we did make this more like partial class based, yeah, not partial class for all the types, but at least that top level type, that JSON context top level type, I can put it in my own namespace. I can name it what I want to name it. And now we just generate a bunch of stuff into that partial class on the side. Like I really do like this design actually from what we have today.
And FYI, Laomi did have some additional material that he's not covering today, which does talk about even other ways to do that. For example, applying an attribute to a serialized method, and that serialized method would the body would get generated. I mean, it does allow us to do whatever we want in a way if we just kind of fill in the blank, pattern.
No, I mean, we yesterday had the community stand-up where we talked about source generation. I mean, I think basically the number one thing that we have here right now is basically that the generator generates new code, and I think it is desirable that the user controls the place where that code goes, right? Because there's just too many ways you could do that, right? Is it public? Is it internal? Is it in this namespace? Is that type or whatever, right? And it's just relatively natural for the people to wanting to control these things. And I don't think we want to come up with new ways to express that for every single generator, right? And so like just letting the user literally type in the, either the method or the type we want to fill in. And then we just apply an attribute on that thing and then say, yep, code goes here, right? And if nothing gets filled in, then it's obviously a compile time error because no type info got generated, no serialized method got generated, and the compiler will tell you that sorry, there's something missing here, right? So you get still the same kind of thing, but you don't have to. I mean, you still have discoverability issues because people have to know to, type in that type name and apply these attributes on them, but that seems a bit easier than to say, apply this assembly level attribute and now magically know there's this type manufactured on the other end, right?
And the fact that you have to add this new namespace everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. Like you have to add not only that, also a thing that VTech pointed out to me is that when you use the source generator, if I give somebody code, I'm like, hey, here, use this code. And they put it into their app, it doesn't work by default because if their app's not named the exact same thing as mine, then the usings don't line up, right?
Okay, so in this case, the metadata approach allows, options like an options instance which can contain configuration that is not represented here, and that that's the fallback where we use the serializer for like reference handling and things like that. So I do believe still that we need to provide a way to have people pass, unless we want to represent even things that are not supported in this, like in this mode, fast path mode, in the design time attribute.
I think these are the right things to represent. It's just this attribute should go on a class, not on an assembly.
Right, but if I also want reference handling, so can one of the contexts I've written down take an options instance so that the serializer would know about reference handling and other features I want to use?
You mean a constructor that we generate on the JSON context?
I mean, a constructor will generate, or maybe the user will provide that partial. Well, I don't know if you can have like a partial constructor, but something to say, hey, these are runtime options that contain things I can't, like we are not representing in the attribute.
We'd still have everything on the JSON context we have today. The only difference that I'm seeing is the user has to partial out the JSON context in a namespace that they want, and then apply the attribute to that.
Yeah, that's just a little like contradictory when I asked the question earlier. Like, we'll still need a way for us to have a runtime option instance passed. So
yep. This is for the fallback, right? I mean, this is for if somebody wants to change the options at runtime that aren't known at design time, how do we get that options instance?
The same way we do today. We generate a constructor on the JSON context class that takes in an options, right? And then they can new up the JSON context class with an options that'll call into that generated constructor.
Okay. The other thing is the serializable types. Should different context types have different like inputs to their like type closure? Like, say today it's specified on the assembly or the type, and then that's assembly wide. Like, per context, do we want to have different types that we generate serialization and metadata for?
That I don't have an answer for right away. I don't know. I could see us going both ways, I guess, having the assembly level JSON serializable, or on each context you have to say, I want type customer, type address, type order on this context, and type product on this context. That I don't know.
Yeah, I would honestly say, let's, if we go down this, the user always types in the context type, I would apply all attributes there and say there is no global fallback, like it's on that type. And if you have 3 contexts and you want the same configuration, I would start with you have to copy and paste it for now, because I think otherwise you just have a more complicated policy where the type is no longer self-describing, right? It's the union between what's on the type and what did you apply at the assembly or module level or whatever, right? And that seems more complicated. I would start with a simple thing where, the user types in the JSON context type that defines the whole universe, and all the configuration is on that type.
One of the usability things with the assembly level JSON serializable attributes was that you have to like specify all of them at the top of the project and scroll back and forth and copy the name. So that's why we had the attribute on the type. Would we want to keep that in that mode?
So which ones? You mean the actual metadata related attributes?
So one of the things I was going to propose is to be able to put the JSON serializable attribute directly on the type, which would be assembly, like which was going to live on the assembly wide context. Do we still want to do that? And
so when you say type, you mean the type that is actually being serialized, not the JSON context.
Yeah, the serializable type. So we're putting we had an attribute. Yeah. So yeah, would we want to still have that? And that would mean that for all your context types, that would contain that type as well, or would we still want the attribute to just be on the context and not have it on the type?
I mean, that one makes more sense to me, because that's kind of, I mean, that's my general question of like, the existing attributes that we have, like JSON property name, for example, I assume you honor those, right? In the generator, right?
Sorry, say that again, please.
So the existing attributes that we have, like JSON property name, for example, that you can put on a property, right? I assume you honor those in the source generator already, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, so I think we already are in this world then where people can configure, their POCOs or whatever with with attributes that put directly on them. And that makes sense to me, right? But I think with serializable types, you always have this tension of like, oh, can I put it directly on the type, or can I do it somewhere else so that I can serialize somebody else's type? And for better or worse, we always end up supporting both, because if you control the type, yeah, it's much more convenient if I can put the attributes directly on that type, right? But if I don't control the type, then, well, I have to put them somewhere else, right? So in that case, yeah, I would probably support them on both the serializable type as well as the context.
So if we went down that approach, when we source gen for a JSON context in an assembly, we would at design time we would look for the other types in that assembly that have JSON serializable attributes on them, and we'd stick those in there as well. So again, in the case where I have 3 JSON contexts, and then one class that was JSON serializable marked with that attribute on itself, that class would get in all 3.
No, I wouldn't do that. I would basically say you always would have to somehow, you basically have to indicate the root types in each JSON context, but you don't have to configure the type entirely. If that makes sense. So for example, let's say you have a person type, right? And the person type has a first name and last name property, and each of them have this JSON property name applied to them, right? Then, but you want the person to be in JSON context A and JSON context B. I still think in both JSON contexts, you would have to either apply an attribute that says I want person A, or you include some other type that happens to transitively reference person A or person B. I would not magically add all JSON serializable types to all contexts. That largely, I think, in my opinion, defeats the purpose of having dedicated context.
Okay, so then you're saying you don't want the commented outline on the bottom constructor to be placed directly on types. JSON serializable attribute, no parens. That's what Leonie was asking about.
By the way, yeah, that's supposed to be uncommented.
I think, sorry, I see.
The proposal was, and you could, today you have to say assembly : JSON serializable open paren type of person. And this proposal was, I have class person, I'm going to put JSON serializable attribute directly on that class.
I believe that's what I'm saying, yes. Because I mean, JSON serializable only controls, it doesn't control how things are being serialized, but it just controls the fact that you do want to generate code for this type, right? In which case, yes, I would want this only to be on the context then.
Okay. So if I have just normal JSON context at the top of that, I have, here's my 5 types that I want generated inside this context. I have 5 JSON serializable attributes, or somehow there's some gesture to say inside this context, here's the 5 top level types I want generated for.
Yep. I mean, that would make the most sense to me, right? Because otherwise, I mean, you kind of want the user to be kind of in control of what is in each context, right?
Agreed.
Okay. Okay, so for the attribute, so assuming we don't have the, so forget the other attribute targets added and constructor. So here I have a generation mode that says for this particular type, like this is the code I would like generated for the type. And I'll go into what the options are and when they'll be honored. So we have JSON no name policy from the attribute above. So yeah, I call it no name policy to stay, like the source generator will need to know what the implementation is. Like you can't pass a type of JSON naming policy because we cannot like light up that type and like execute the convert method. So it has to be something we know what the implementation is. So that's why I say either unspecified or built-in camel case.
So you're saying I cannot generate a JSON serializer that uses Pascal case?
And Pascal case is what you get by default. Like we just don't do any conversion.
Sorry, why can't the generator do that?
Because
take
it's
an arbitrary,
an arbitrary policy.
Yeah.
So it could take a type and instantiate it today, right? Because our naming policies don't have anything weird with them. They just have a base class. So as long as you know the type in theory, at design time you could instantiate it and invoke the convert method.
I'll need to verify because I think
that's bad, right? I mean, you generally can't assume that the generator can execute user code, right? Doing compilation, right?
That was the
like you would
I
have,
was running into.
So you would have to.
Yeah. Okay.
So the best you could do is you could generate the code that calls into the naming policy at runtime, But that seems problematic because if two things are mapped to the same thing, now bad things might happen, right? Like that. So I think you want to know the actual strings doing execution of the generator, right?
Is that something that the generator would have warned on to different properties collapsing to the exact same value or the exact same name?
Well, you would produce invalid JSON at runtime, right?
No, that JSON's valid. It's just weird. But
well, is it valid to have multiple keys?
Absolutely.
I thought that's
it is absolutely. It's granted, yeah. Most deserializers will fail when they see it, but it's absolutely valid syntactically.
At runtime, we throw an error when two property names have the same value because we don't know what so when we see the payload on deserialization, we don't know which property to set. So that's why we throw the exception.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have a strong problem with the naming policy being unextensible, but it does seem a bit weird that the only one that's listed here is built-in camel case when, you know, as you said, Pascal case is trivial. It's just don't do anything. Like at least it seems desirable to list the 3 ones or whatever that we have built-in support for, right?
Today, we don't expose a JSON naming policy, which is the default. So the only public one we expose is the camel case.
Oh, interesting. So basically you're saying unspecified would mean
is
Pascal
the default
case, basically.
Yeah.
We assume the default naming is Pascal case. I mean, that's where that term came from here, but
oh, because when people write the DTOs, it's basically whatever you put in the DTO.
Whatever you
right. It's not Pascal case. It's whatever
whatever the user type
property's named.
Yeah.
I mean, this is to open up the question, like the discussion around all of these bools and naming policies and whatever. Are they completely, 100% always static, or do we want to loosen that up in certain cases? Like if we don't know the naming policy, for example, and that decision can come later, I think. And then we could add some conditional logic and some caching logic to handle some of these cases. I mean, I know it complicates things, and I think Lane was trying to keep it simple. But there is that discussion. Maybe we don't want to have it right now.
No, and that's a good point, right? If this is a common case, then we shouldn't block this. And like you said, it can always come later if it needs to.
I mean, if I had it my way, I would really try to get everything statically describable. And if, for example, you want the user to extend it, I would come up with an attribute way to extend it, but in a way that the user statically tells you, oh, I want XML to be all lowercase, and I have to apply an attribute that says, name mapping, and then pass in 2 strings or something. But because otherwise, as soon as you open this up to polymorphic extensibility, it just means now that you have this runtime fallback you have to emit code for, which seems just backwards to what we try to achieve here.
Right. It's no longer the fast path.
Yeah.
Right. You have to just basically source gen all of the serializer at the end of the day.
And I really think you want to know the string at emit time, right? Because that really opens up your way to do interesting things like dictionaries that you can generate, and you can't really do that really when you don't know the name central runtime. And I think the other question really is like, what do you do with? I think you probably have to assume people want to control the names more, right? Because that's the way like things are being emitted sometimes. But I think if my assumption would be if people want to extend it, we would have to find a way to do that statically. And I think that's still fine. I think you can still contrive of schemes that would not hurt the fast path. You just make the compile time potentially slower because you have to do more metadata lookups, but who cares, right? The runtime would still be super fast.
And one way to look at it, an abstract way, is to think that if you could modify any of these bools and naming policies, and we expect to dynamically adjust to it in the generated code, the code you'd end up with is a serializer.
Right.
Okay.
So we're saying go with the enum approach? Is that what we ended up with?
I mean, I think that's probably the closest, yeah. Enum plus maybe custom attributes with dedicated mappings if people really want to do that.
which we can add later.
Exactly.
So just enums for now. This enum.
Yeah, I don't understand the JSON generation mode though.
Okay.
Let's
So
talk.
yeah, let me talk about it. So today, like the assumption is, so the way it's worked is today the source generator generates only metadata for types, and now we're having a mode where we can generate fast path code. So if the JSON serializer options attribute is used, then that tells us, like, my proposal is that we should generate metadata and serialization. So we generate the fast path logic and also the metadata for the object properties, object members.
I see.
So we should do both. So this provides a way to say, hey, I know I'm not going to need a fallback at runtime. So I can set the mode for a type to serialization. So the default is metadata and serialization, saying that if there's adjacent serializer options used, then that tells us that's the opt-in for fastpath, right? So if no properties are set, then that means default options. If properties are set, then those are the values. Then so we'll do both. Then metadata only says like, hey, I know fastpath is never going to work, and I don't want more code. Just generate the metadata. So they are configurable on a type per type basis. And
if I
so to
pick
translate, metadata means slow path and serialization is the fast path, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, not slow, I mean, I wouldn't say slow, I just mean the serializer.
Yeah, it's basically you generate the metadata and then the serializer is still running at runtime, right? And it just calls into the metadata as instead of reflection, right?
Yeah.
Two questions on this is if I just say .serialization and I pass in incompatible options, I assume I get an exception.
Yeah, we'll throw an exception saying, hey,
you have incompatible options, which is right. I think that's the right thing. The other thing is,
null.
Well, yeah. Give me an exception when I did something wrong. The second question I have is there what cases do we know of where we can't generate the serialization logic? Are there any, maybe is the first question? Because if that's the default, is there any cases where we'll either error out in the source gen or maybe I not generate the serialization logic?
No, I don't think that there's no options configuration here that we cannot generate source code for. So I expect that unless metadata is unless the mode is set to metadata, I expect that we'll always generate the serialization code.
Okay, for any user defined types, like no matter what their shape is, if they have recursion, etc., we can always generate the serialization code.
For any typing is what I'm thinking, unless the type is just not supported.
Just for clarity, though, only the options that are supported are listed here. The serializer has a bunch of other features that aren't represented here.
Yeah. I'm not talking about the options. I'm talking about if my class, I did my class in such a way where I couldn't generate the serialization code.
I mean, there's collection types and other things that aren't going to work right as well.
With the serializer or with the source gen error in those cases where you said by default we're saying we want metadata and serialization.
So I'm thinking that there's no limitation based on the type today. The type is fine. We should be able to generate fast path logic for any type.
The fallback will handle everything. If that was the question, I'm not sure exactly what the question was anymore. But the code that's generated definitely will handle a very small subset of serialization features, right?
Let me ask the question maybe slightly differently. So what would happen if we were to say the only thing we support is serialization? We don't support the other ones at all. In other words, the serializer would, or the source gen would only support the fast path. If your object does not fit into that whatever subset we support, then it's always reflection based.
Doesn't that kill the utility of this though? Because I imagine we have a significant number of customers who want to make these tiny tweaks to the output. even something like write indented, right?
Well, I mean, I guess the question is now, like, what is the set of scenarios for which we support source gen for, right? And that, there's certainly some MVP aspect to it where we could support more. We just haven't written the code. So, for example, indented to me seems like something that we could trivially support. It's just more code versus other things like custom converters might be super complicated, right? And so we might never support them, right? And so the question is now, like, where do we see this, right? Because I mean, we had this discussion a few weeks ago, right, where Jan was saying maybe we should just say, like, we have this super simple dynamic system that's reflection based, supports everything, and then we have this, more optimized thing, and that only supports the subset, and there really is no middle ground. It's like if you want to use source gen, yep, sorry, you can't do certain things and you have to use reflection if you want to do the other stuff.
But I think that's okay though, because for instance, some of the examples that came up were custom converters or custom naming policy, stuff like that. That's not reflection based at that point. Like, we actually have a target method to call into that we know at compile time. Like, we could literally just emit calls straight to those methods.
Yeah, I mean, so those features, yes, but there are scenarios where folks are using the serializer in non-trivial ways, like non-trivial features like async and like other features. Async is probably like maybe the most compelling one in this discussion, or custom converters. For converters here, we can support it, but async, like, we don't really want to generate like async code that does all the buffer management and like moving on and graying and things like that, because that would be really buggy, and that's a common feature that people need. And some of the folks that we're talking to internally, like looking at the JSON code, do use at least async. And
sure.
It's like,
I guess what I'm struggling with is I don't understand I guess that because it also was Eric's question of like, what is the, like, if I use this, like, why would I ever be unhappy with the option serialization? Why would I ever have to use metadata and serialization or metadata to actually get stuff to work? If that makes sense.
If you are using one of the, so I think later in this issue, I show what features will be supported or not. So the answer is, like, if you care about one of the features that will not be supported generated code, then you would need to have like metadata and serialization or just metadata.
Yeah, maybe we should talk about that, because I think it would be helpful for us to understand, is this just a point in time of us not having typed in the code, or is that a conceptual, without us emitting some metadata or something, we just can't do it at runtime situation? Because then one of them is just, it's, we only have feature set X today and we're okay with that and we ship that. And the other one is like, okay, we really have to make a decision on like how important we think these scenarios are for people that use the source gen. Because basically, to me, I still would like to live in a world where the generated JSON serializer is I guess simple code, as in you open it in Reflector and like you look at it and it looks nice and fast and efficient, but it's also the feature is usable enough that the vast majority of our people could use it if they're willing to change small things about the way they do JSON serialization, right? So I try to find the sweet spot where we can cut some of the complexity without losing scenarios, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, my hunch or my feeling about this is that if we don't have, so there are some features that we could support in future, like converters, encoder, things like that, possibly. Some things like async and reference handling would be no to ever do that. And the other consideration is the amount of code that we will generate. Like, size is a concern for some folks. Like, they want private bytes. So if we're generating all the serializer features in code, which will never be all of them, it's just a ton of code, and some people would not want to use that. So
no, that one I agree with, but that also cuts some metadata too, right? I mean, if you bit metadata, that's also not free, right?
But there are other parts, right?
The amount of code is not that much for the metadata.
If you're using the metadata, if you're using the metadata approach, you still get a bunch of benefits, right? Like, we don't have to use ref emit anymore. right? That's super valuable for a lot of things. It's trim compatible, right? That's valuable in some cases too. The startup, yeah, there's still value, even, you know, but the metadata fallback allows you to do everything that the serializer can do.
Yeah, don't get my feedback as like, I absolutely want to kill metadata, right? I just try to understand where that dividing line is, right? And because I mean, to me, it still resonates with what Jan said. It's like, because I mean, every time we see these VCL APIs, and we try to, land at the happy middle ground, we very often end up in this valley of no customers, right? Where it's like it's not quite efficient enough for people that actually care about the efficiency, but also not quite usable enough so that people still use the reflection-based approach. And that's kind of I don't have a good handle on that. It's just that's why I'm trying to ask these maybe very pointed and probing questions, but I kind of try to understand, like, if we cut this entirely, like, what would actually fall over? Like, what features can I use, right?
Yeah, so I mean, we can maybe take a look to see what the features would be and what would not, and then if that's useful.
I mean, I think the scenarios are, if you know you're going to change the options at runtime, then you either have to do metadata and serialization or metadata. If you know you're never going to change the options, then use the serialization flag, and you'll just get an error. If you do change them, you'll get an exception, and then you don't also have extra code bloat for metadata.
It seems like a pretty good trade-off.
Yeah, I don't think we can cut metadata, honestly. And we obviously can't cut serialization because that's the full blown.
Well, that's the feature.
Yeah, exactly. That's the one. But I meant the serialization. That's the one. If you want the best of everything, that's where you should go, right?
We could still fall back to dynamic, right?
We could. You're saying like just have serialization, and if
just to address Steve's issue, though, the only time when we would not fall back to dynamic would be, for instance, if we trimmed it out for size wins.
Yeah, that would be an option 2, the serialization flag that Naomi added there. It would say just generate the serialization logic, and the quote unquote metadata is baked into that code, and there's no fallback. There's no dynamic capabilities, and no support for features like reference handling and async and that sort of thing.
Right.
I think I understand your question better now, Eric. Like, you're saying you use the source gen API, you're passing in JSON context, but then we still use reflection to build up metadata and still use ref emit?
Yeah, I'm saying that there's multiple fallbacks that we're talking about here. I was just trying to clarify that because based on what Steve said, there was like this assumption that you'd set the fast path, and then if you chose a different option at if you needed different options at runtime, then you'd see an exception. It depends. Is like because there's 3 layers that we're talking, or 3 different levels that we're talking about here. There's fast path, there's serialization with metadata, and then there's dynamic, which is no source generated influence. So that's all I was trying to clarify. I didn't have a point to make, just clarification.
Okay. The major drawback with doing the fallback all the way to use reflection is that now you're no longer trim compatible. Like, you're not guaranteed trimability.
Right. So
yeah, I guess my question is, like, if you care about trimability, right? Like, why couldn't we say you have to make serialization work? You can't rely on metadata and serialization. Like, do you know what I mean? Like it's basically this, like, why do we need this middle ground? Or why can't we just say, if you don't care, you just use reflection based? Maybe you have to say the whole assembly is not linker state, so we can't trim anything in that assembly. And that gets you an amount of the way. And if you want to subset, then tough luck.
I'd say remember that there are many users of this feature, and not everyone is concerned with linkability. So there's a subset of users who, like, for instance, consider people like Bing, where, you know, they or even Cosmos or others who may want, you know, the full of the larger set of features provided by the metadata approach, but they won't know that up front. There's the benefit of not requiring writable pages that we get with metadata compared to, yeah, I guess it's back to Steve's now that sorry for walking myself through it. It's back to Steve. Like, the metadata helps you deal with multiple options. I think that's the biggest benefit of it. Because if you know that if you can commit to a single set of options, then you wouldn't need the metadata approach.
Yeah, I guess that's my question. Why would that not be okay to tell Bing like, yeah, if you want those benefits, that's the price you pay for that?
Because all the other features of the serializer, like reference handling, like as soon as you want reference handling, now you have to have slower startup and ref emit.
And
so also that's kind of my question. Like, but why can't we support reference handling in the serializer? Like, is that a fundamental limitation, or is it just because we haven't done the work?
No, okay. If you specify the options with metadata, you're going to get those I'll fall back to those features.
Right, and Emo's pushing for maybe not pushing. Emo's questioning why we need metadata, the metadata approach at all. Why isn't it just if you're using source gen, it's just the fast pass serialization, and for everything else, it does what it does today, using reflection and reference.
Yep. So I think maybe that goes back to Eric's comment too, is that and the other thing about the benefits you get, there are benefits with using metadata versus IL emit today. I mean, you get a lot of the startup benefits, not everything. You might get some throughput because we're avoiding some dictionary lookups, and you use less private bytes. So there are, benefits to using the metadata other than the performance benefits and trimming benefits, as well as the the functionality side of things that aren't supported with CodeGen.
And every new feature that we add to the serializer, right? Like, if a new one comes along, we would have to say, well, you also need to put this into source gen, or else we can't put this in at all.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the general problem that we have, right? Like, no, every new feature we basically have to write twice, pretty much, right? Unless we can say you only get it via the metadata fallback, right? Well, I guess in this case you still write it twice, but
well, it's a smaller change.
Yeah.
You'd only write it twice if you want to make the fast path work with that new feature. If there's a new feature that comes in, if we have the metadata approach, if there's a new feature that comes in, it automatically works with the new metadata, with the metadata approach.
In some cases, we might have to write a little bit of code to the generator to actually parse that metadata from like attributes and stuff, but it's really minimal compared to modifying serialization generation logic. So both of them require us to add more code, but the metadata approach allows us to write way less code. That's it.
Right. So, okay, so if we live in a world where we need these modes, I think the proposal here with the Init makes sense. I mean, I don't know what else you would do. It's a bit unfortunate that that's a decision the user has to make, but I mean, I think the proposal here also to do both is probably fine as the default because it gives people the most features. And then they can subset from there.
They don't have to make a decision. It's just by default, we're going to generate both metadata and serialization.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I meant, right? So you have a default that is conservative, and if people want, control more, they can, right? So that's, yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, and also we wouldn't generate serialization even with metadata and serialization if no options are specified. So by default, it will just be the metadata, effectively.
Oh, then we should rename enum value.
No, I think the default is actually correct because it says if the JSON serializer options attribute is used, then generate metadata. If not, so just be.
I kind of think then we should just name this default. Like, because if it's named metadata and serialization, and whether serialization gets gend or not is dependent on something else.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. I think I mean,
also, why wouldn't we also always generate serialization code and just use the default options? Like, why would I have to opt in?
If you know you always change the options to some unsupported value, for example, then you don't end up with extra code that that's never gonna get called.
Yeah.
Well, if I know that I don't want it, I can just set it to metadata. Right? Like, so just think brand new user. I want to serialize person. I have my JSON context. I say I want to serialize person, and I say okay, serialize. I don't pass any options in. I don't do anything. All I say is I want to serialize it. What we're saying is you're not going to get the fast path in that scenario.
Yeah, I thought you were proposing to remove the metadata in, remember?
I wasn't.
But
I mean,
didn't
so I'll
you
just
say why wouldn't we always generate serialization? That kind of implies you can't select just metadata.
No, sorry. By default, if nobody specified the generation mode, I'm saying by default we should generate both metadata and the fast path. And the fast path uses the default options because you didn't tell me which options to use. And then at runtime, if you're using the default options, which you get by default, then we'll use that fast path code.
I mean, the reason why
proposal. No?
The reason why it's not it requires the JSON serializer options actually to be placed on the context. Like, I mean, given the new design, right?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I see.
It requires us, even if it's empty, meaning no options are specified. That is what would mean using default options. You just put JSON serializer options on it. And the reason is like,
Gotcha.
I'm not sure, like metadata is the one we're saying supports all features, and folks might not want like extra code. I mean, I guess
if they don't want that extra code, then set it to .metadata, right?
Yeah, I guess the question is, what's a good default? I thought it was to do both. Maybe it's just to do serialization.
No, that's not what I'm saying either. I'm saying I think the default is to do both by default all the time.
Oh, yeah.
That is the default. It's just not named default.
But that's not what Laomi said was the default. The default.
I'm assuming because it was 0, it's the default. But...
Well, no, that's not the default behavior. What I understood Laomi to say was the default behavior is if you just say I want to opt into JSON serialization and I didn't provide a JSON serialization options at the attribute, then I'm only generating metadata. Is that true, Laomi?
That is true. That is what I was saying.
Okay, I would agree with Eric that seems not great. I would just say you generate both and use the default options if nothing is specified.
Yeah, we can do that.
Because that seems more self-consistent. And it's also an easier default to explain. It's like if you don't say anything, you always get metadata and serialization.
Which
default? And if you want anything else, then you have to do something.
Which default? We still have different defaults for web.
It would be.
Yeah, we pick one. I mean, we can decide to pick the JSON serializer options .default, right? That would be the default.
I would assume that's named default today. I would assume we would pick that one.
Yeah.
Which means that it wouldn't be used in ASP.NET.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. But then also, I think you could argue that if you do source gen, you should specify options. I mean, we could also say we just failed and say, you always have to specify an options instance. You always have to specify what options you want. You don't get to rely on ambient defaults that you may not be aware of what they are.
Unless
we get to choose, right?
Unless you specify metadata only.
I see. Do we want a shortcut here for people who do want to generate a fast path for web?
Well, the problem is that today we call into them, right? So that would be, we would have to now statically describe them somehow, right? So they couldn't change anymore.
We implement it.
We do. We have an option. There's a JSON serializer defaults. There's a general and then a web.
Right.
So we could have maybe a constructor on the JSON serializer options that takes a JSON serializer default value, and then if you call that constructor, then you use that value. Maybe something like that.
Or just straight up on the class, like the options. Yeah. If you scroll up to the options attribute, right? One of these things should be JSON serializer defaults.
Mm.
And then if you specify web, then you get web.
So would it be nullable, meaning that nullable means use that, I mean, non-null means use that, and null means read values of the rest of the properties.
I guess, yeah. Something like that.
Is that like a pattern that we use, or?
Yeah, I mean, sort of. I mean, for attributes, it's a bit weird, but like, probably nullable types aren't CLS compliant, but I don't think we care.
We can have a nullable attribute property, right? I can check.
Besides adding some sort of way to set the web defaults, I think the usage of it, at least for the web stuff, is gonna cause it to go to fall back. I think they use the async stuff, and then they're also heavily dependent on the data extension property. So it's a little more complicated, I think, than just these static options.
Yeah, they use the property name case insensitive, which for fastpath deserialization wouldn't be supported just initially, in my view. So actually, maybe it's not a great idea, since we can't statically. We won't support it right now.
Maybe peel that off and do a later feature. Look at everything.
Yeah, but I think I mean that peeling it off is reasonable, but I think we have to tackle it. Otherwise, it's a bit toyish, right? Because I mean, like the number one use case for JSON serialization is effectively calling a web server, right? And so you want stuff to actually bind, right?
Yeah.
So if they give you back camel case coding and you can't use the fastpath serialization code, then well, that's not super useful.
Yeah, it looks like only 3 things, right? It only sets 3 things. It sets case insensitive property names, camel casing naming policy, and the number handling to allow reading from string.
Right. So those things are currently not supported in the fastpath.
The camel casing is the only thing that is supported. Case insensitive and number handling isn't?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with
I mean, as long as we can add them, I think, it's okay to say we don't have that feature, but it's on the roadmap or something. But I feel like I mean, presumably we want the fast path to be, usable enough, right? And I feel like you kind of have to be able to deserialize from a server that is using ASP.NET and happens to use the defaults.
Well, know that as proposed, we're only supporting serialization, writing. For now.
Oh, we don't do so. I see. Never mind that. When you only do one direction, then it doesn't matter, right? Yeah, I guess that's fair.
I agree. We can peel it off, but it's a high priority thing. It's a pretty default-ish thing to support.
Yeah. So then, so we are over time now, so I think we should probably wrap up. And we only got to one of the JSON issues, which is slightly concerning. In terms of next actions, I think we gave a lot of high-level feedback and very little super specific feedback. I probably will push it back to needs work, but I think like let me just paste in the notes that I had, and you can tell me whether I missed something. Like I haven't really changed the API shape. I just copy pasted it in for completeness, so we know what we actually looked at today. So then I actually scroll up, you can actually see the notes. So I think the big one is, that's probably a major design change on your side, is like this, thinking of multiple different JSON contexts kind of thing. That will probably imply that the JSON serializable attribute would only be applicable to classes, because I don't think we want to support structs for JSON contexts or interfaces. That seems odd. And then we also would probably remove the assembly level attribution as well, right? Everything else seems kind of still applicable, like the policy, the generation mode. And then for the JSON serializer options, you kind of said like, yeah, the naming is not necessarily awesome because it implies this relationship with the existing options, which we may not want. And then there was this whole namespace discussion of like, should we just take all the JSON stuff that is for source generation and put it into some namespace to make it a bit easier to understand, which stuff is specific for source generation and which stuff is generic or applicable to reflection only.
I wanted to have like a preview of the fastpath stuff for 5, preview 5. So how much of the changes would we want to see in the design at that point? To see.
I mean, more is better, right? Because I mean, the closer you are to the design that we want, the better it is for customer feedback, right? The further away we are, the more indirect feedback we now get, because the feedback we're getting is not the actual feedback.
Okay.
So, but like I understand that it's a major shift. So, give it a thought, but don't do unnatural acts, right?
And then
I think it's a good shift.
That's fine. No, it's fine. But the other thing is, so if we mark as needs work now, like, is it okay to still check something in that aligns with the feedback that we?
My opinion is yes, but I mean, I have said many times in the past that I wouldn't block check-in based on API review. It's just we just have to keep track the API reviews. We have to get it done, right? So long we do that, I think it's fine. The concern that we had is usually that it's harder to track when the approved design doesn't match what's checked in, because it's a bit harder to track. But I'm totally cool with that when crunch time happens, because it's the only way for us to make progress.
Then, but I did want to mention I got some feedback around like other patterns. If you scroll like somewhere down in the issue, just to mention there's some considerations for future that sorry, I'm scrolled. Scroll further down. The patterns around generic like partial static methods.
Is it a comment or is it
a comment? Yes, sorry. So here's an idea from Jan here, and like just scrolling up a little bit.
Oh, this one here generated.
Yeah, this is a pattern that was also discussed. Like, so it's mostly around like usability, because the characteristics of this versus the proposal, like there's not much performance overhead added by what we're trying to do here. But,
I mean, that is kind of what I'm thinking, but I think of this as a type level attribution rather than a method level attribution. But that's kind of where I was heading with my description. Yeah.
The reason the type level is better is because then we can actually pass it into ASP.NET, and then ASP.NET can serialize and call back this method, right? Where here, if you just have this, you have to attribute one method that serializes my into a writer.
Can't pass it around, yeah.
Yeah, how do you pass that thing around, right? Like you need to delegate to it.
Yeah, that's my thought as well for it. So just wanted to mention it here, and I'll just document it as like alternatives considered and things like that.
Yeah. But I mean, I do like this. Also, I like the name, quite frankly. Like, I think I when I talked with Eric offline at some point, I had a similar proposal, but it was type level based, because I like the name generated somewhere, because it makes it clear that something is happening here, right?
Yeah.
And I think we do have to have the discussion as well. If we do generate methods like this that are very low level reader and writer wrappers, and there's nothing, no value add, say that the serializer has today, like even exception handling. You know, if you're deserializing some vanilla JSON, for example, and you'd get normally a reader exception, do we care about that raw exception propagating today? We, you know, catch it and throw a JSON exception, which has additional information like the property path and things like that. So there's kind of a question I have about kind of like quality of service on some of these low level APIs, because it's not the serializer, but do we try to emulate some of the functionality it has or not?
I mean, I think you get to decide largely. I think you could, I mean, this is the other thing, right? I want to avoid like a gazillion different things we need to generate. So that's the other reason why I like types, because you get to decide, you know, on this JSON serializer, sorry, this JSON context type, you could generate nested types that are derived from something that already have a, you know, a serialized method on them of T basically, where they take a writer and then that's the one you emit, but they also have other overloads that just take streams and stuff that you can handle in the base type. And then you could imagine a world where we had the lowest level one that just takes the reader writer, doesn't do any sort of exception propagation, it just literally lets it fly off. And then the higher level ones that take streams, maybe they do the wrapping and then throw a JSON exception or something, right? And then you can layer it a little bit more pay for play friendly without having to generate a gazillion different combinations of, you know, input and output types. Right. I think that's the other reason why I don't like these method level attribution, because then it's very hard for us to extend, right? Versus if you emit a type that derives from some base type, it's much easier for us, right? We can use virtuals, we can override potentially, or we can just say, yep, they're just, you know, handled in the base transparently. It's a bit more.
Or in this case, all that stuff's handled in JSON serializer, right? Like having all the overrides that take a writer or a stream or bytes or whatever.
That's exactly what the serializer provides, and the relationship between the serializer and the fast path is what you just described, where the serializer,
I mean, it would be nice, like in general, like if you can pass in the individual serializers for individual types as well as the context as a whole, right? So I think, and that's the other reason why types are.
You pass in the JSON type info, and his proposal was to have a serialized delegate on it, I think is what it was. It was like an action.
Yeah. The serializer will call that early on if it can. And then users can also call that themselves. So it's very similar to the call pattern is very similar to the one we just saw downstairs. I mean,
right. If you know the exact type, if you're calling JSON serializer of T, you have to pass in JSON type info, right? You have to say, give my JSON context and call dot customer or person or whatever on it.
Yeah, I guess it also boils down to naming, I guess. Like
it's because it comes from metadata. It's in the metadata.
Right. So like, I guess the other thing is like, it would be nice if the generated JSON context or whatever would just, I guess, not expose the metadata itself. It would just expose the serializer's metadata's implementation detail. But to me, there's like two reasons for that. One of them is like, you know, we already have too much reflection-based types in the framework. And the other one is like, are we really confident we never want to change them? Because if we can hide them entirely and can just say the only thing people pass around are these, you know, things that deal with that, then it's maybe easier. But I understand that, yeah, you have to split between the, you know, the low-level serializer and the type info that does more work at runtime, right? But yeah,
there's also flow of control issues. You're right. Once you hand over control to a serialized method like this, it becomes very hard to generate code that can handle any kind of fallback cases. Like if you run out of data, you know, in a stream, you have to go back to the reader or go back to the stream, ask for data, you know, update the reader, blah, blah, blah. That code is going to be very verbose, and any kind of trim savings you get is instantly going to go away after you create a few of these POCOs.
Yeah,
if you're generating everything.
All right, so I think let me just click comment on the thing here, otherwise we lose it. people generally happy, or did I make somebody fundamentally unhappy with my comments? I mean, I like where this is going, to be honest. Like, it's just, it's, as I said, like, I'm not pushing for a particular direction. I'm just kind of asking whether we are okay with the direction that we chose based on the feedback we have gotten. But it seems like what we have is the right direction. There's some minor tweaks in the high level user experience.
Yeah, that's good feedback for me.
All right, so then let's call it a day, and then I guess next Tuesday we should then tackle the other two issues. Is that early enough for you, Leomi?
Yeah, that's fine. I might bring this back to yes.
Yeah, totally. I mean, if you have it ready by Tuesday, then we can totally take another look on that as well.
That sounds good. Thanks a lot.
Otherwise, you have like, I think, what is the next one? I think Thursday, and then the other one is Friday. So like you will have 3 options next week to bring it back.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, then unless there's more, I would call it a day and wish everybody a great weekend.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thanks. You too. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks.